The drummers of Burundi have a long and proud tradition. Once they entertained local rulers. Now the centuries-old rhythms are helping these street children develop their self-confidence. Such children are often abandoned because of poverty and the after-effects of war. Bellarmine was 3 when he ended up on the street. He lives in a home sponsored by Burundi Kids, a German aid organization. He says he was left alone by his parents and forced to fend for himself on the streets. For a year, he relied on strangers for food and a place to sleep. But now, thanks to the charity, he's top of his class and thrilled to be able to go to school. I like it here, he says. There are rules, and that's better than on the street. For many of the children, playing by the rules is a new experience. Social worker Bienvenue Munyerere says that's because they've been forgotten by society and left to their own devices. He explains how local and European aid organizations attempt to re-socialize the children and give them the moral skill set that will help them function both in society and in a family, something that was missing for them. By giving the children a stable and secure environment, aid groups try to stop them from slipping into the cycle of violence, drug abuse, and fear that many were exposed to on the streets. Bellarmine told me about his experience. It wasn't safe where I was sleeping, he says. I had nightmares about bandits with weapons and machetes. I was scared. But the gangs of children who roam Burundi's streets are just one example of the country's struggles with the scars of its civil war. In the capital Bujumbura, the market recently burned down after an arson attack. EU Commissioner Andris Piebalgs has promised to help rebuild the complex, but he's also demanding transparency from the government.
For European values, I think it's crucial because I have a mandate to do development aid if countries follow the human rights. I know that there are a lot of countries with some challenges, but what's important is the engagement of the countries to prosecute concrete cases and to be on track of following human rights.
Burundi's government depends on foreign aid for about half of its budget. Most of the money comes from the EU and its member states. They also fund projects that help reintegrate refugees from the civil war, improve the infrastructure, and feed people. Almost 60% of the children under 5 are undernourished. EU Commissioner Piebalgs wants to see how EU money can be put to use here. He's come to discuss how the EU can work with the local government to break the cycle of poverty.
90% of population of the country is involved in agricultural sector. And there is not enough land, so the families are growing too fast, and that means that there is a need to really diversify economy.
Donations from the EU are helping finance projects to help guarantee access to quality food through better planting techniques. Another project aims to provide farmers with livestock to help raise their living standard. Ruvahafi Tarsis received a cow through the program. He says his family has benefited from additional income they get by selling milk. He says one advantage of raising cattle is that he doesn't have to sell banana plants anymore to buy school supplies for his children. Many in Burundi's lowlands depend on outside assistance to make ends meet. Some, like Hélène Nanyawi, can only get by with the help of their neighbors. She doesn't even know how old she is. She lost 5 children and her husband to illness, the civil war, and the unrest that followed. Life expectancy in Burundi is only around 50 years. To survive, Hélène Nanyawi was forced to sell off her property bit by bit until only her house remained. She tells me she has 2 sons who survived. One is the father of this baby. But work is hard to come by, and she can't afford food. Burundi is a bitterly poor country. Most residents don't have access to education and can't afford basics like health care. Chances to escape from poverty are few and far between. Hélène says she's given up on her dreams for her children. She says she has to go to the neighbors when it rains. She's very poor, and she cries a lot. She's in a very bad way. With malnourishment, unsanitary living conditions, and a humid climate, disease spreads quickly in Burundi. Malaria is also a threat, and for many, simple preventive measures like mosquito nets are too expensive. Joël Nibigira, a local doctor, says he's sometimes overwhelmed by the challenges Burundi faces. He often can't treat patients who could be cured because there's no money for medicine. Sometimes they can help, he says, when there's money. But when they can't do anything, they just pray together, even though they know what the diagnosis is. If it's malaria, for example, and they don't have any money for treatment, they can only pray. It's very sad. The EU is financing a series of health initiatives, such as this hospital in Matana. Commissioner Piebalgs is meeting with officials to discuss possible conflicts of interest, like the use of generic copies of European medication. He asks if they're using generic medication. The minister tells him that Burundi's hospitals are dependent on cheap drugs to make sure that even the poorest citizens have access to treatment. Piebalgs also wants to know what steps the government is taking against infant mortality. 166 of every 1,000 children don't reach their 5th birthday. Burundi's health minister introduces the commissioner to a patient who's here for a checkup. The government hopes better preventive care will help bring down mortality rates. Preventive care is also a priority in the new health center in Kamina. This village, not far from Bujumbura, is the birthplace of Reverend Alphonse Ndabiseruye. He was injured during the Civil War in the 1990s and brought to Germany for treatment. After his recovery, he completed his PhD there. But he refused a well-paying job at Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg and returned to Burundi. Now he directs development projects for the church. He tells me about the first gift he wanted to give the region. His plan was to build a school. As a French author once said, when you build a school, you close a prison. During Burundi's civil war, this village was the scene of ethnic violence between Hutu and Tutsi. Today, it's a place of education where young people come together. Many criticize international aid efforts, saying they turn people into dependent aid recipients. But Reverend Alphonse says this aid can enable people to help themselves, and it's his job to remind them of that. To quote President Obama, yes, we can. We can accomplish a lot, but there are still many who waste time. We need 3 things: brains, heart, and hands. And that philosophy is already paying off. Tea has become a major export for Burundi in the last several years. In addition to coffee and cotton, it's one of the few products the country exports. The director of a local tea factory, Anisetu Yaga, wants to show the commissioner how EU funds are improving quality. He tells Commissioner Piebalgs that the new machines have allowed the farmers to charge 100 francs more per kilo. That's, of course, a boon for workers because they have more cash on hand. Because the quality of the tea has improved dramatically, it's fetching a higher price on the international market, almost twice as much as before. But there are still problems, according to the EU representative. the energy infrastructure is seriously lacking, and that drives up operating costs.
So for us, it's actually very good investment to fight poverty, but for the country, it's a huge, well, relatively huge income of foreign currency. The next challenge is access to energy, because there are some projects with some hydro energy that could be used, and again will decrease costs of the production.
The EU hopes to invest 50 million euros in renewable energy projects. At present, only 3.4% of the population has access to electricity. Increasing that would be a key step to improving living conditions and preventing more children from falling into poverty. Wenceslas Benda once lived on this street. Today, he's a social worker in the capital, Bujumbura. He tells me he feels called to help children on the street and give them a safe space and supply their basic needs, so they'll get the respect they deserve. The first step is to gain the trust of the children. 9-year-old Justin is making good progress. The future, he says, is in school and not on the street. You're not going to find work if you haven't learned anything. If you go to school, you can even work in the president's office someday. But for him and his country, the dream of a better future has only just begun.